December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The sun hung low over the Pacific, casting long shadows across the naval base as the USS Arizona rocked gently against its mooring. Lieutenant Commander Franklin Van Valkenburg gripped the railing of the bridge, his knuckles white against the salt-crusted metal. The air was thick with the hum of idling engines and the distant chatter of sailors on deck below. But something felt off, a prickling unease that made the hairs on his neck stand up. Radar blips had flickered on the screens earlier, dismissed as expected B-17s from the mainland. Now the horizon shimmered unnaturally, broken by faint specks growing larger by the second. "Captain, you seeing this?" Ensign Hayden Poole's voice cut through the morning calm, his finger jabbing at the binoculars pressed to his eyes. The young officer's face was pale, sweat beading on his brow despite the cool trade winds. Van Valkenburg snatched the glasses, focusing on the shapes, not American bombers, but sleek twin-engine silhouettes slicing through the clouds. Nakajima B-5N, Kates, he realized with a gut punch, Japanese torpedo planes, their red sun insignias glinting like blood on the wings. Alarms shattered the air, klaxons wailing as the first wave descended. Explosives tore into the water nearby, sending geysers of foam skyward. The deck shuddered underfoot, and Van Valkenburg barked orders, his voice steady amid the chaos. "General quarters. Man the anti-aircraft guns. Signal the fleet, it's an attack." Sailors scrambled like ants on a disturbed hill, boots pounding against steel as they hauled 5-inch 38 caliber guns into position. The smell of gun oil mixed with the sharp tang of fear sweat, and in the distance, the USS Oklahoma listed as torpedoes slammed into her side, her hull groaning like a dying beast. Van Valkenburg's mind raced. He was no stranger to drills, but this was real, raw, unrelenting. The Arizona's crew, 177 souls under his temporary command while the admiral was ashore, looked to him now. A Zero fighter streaked low, machine guns chattering, bullets stitching holes in the forecastle. Men screamed, blood spraying across the grey paint. "Fire at will," he roared. Shouldering his own .50 caliber mount, the gun bucked in his hands, brass casings clattering hot to the deck as he tracked the enemy plane, its engine whining in protest. But the orders from Fleet Command crackled over the radio moments later, distorted by static. "All ships retreat to defensive positions, conserve ammunition, await reinforcements." Van Valkenburg froze, the words echoing in his ears like a death sentence. Retreat, with the sky blackening under a second wave of Val dive bombers? He glanced at Poole, whose eyes widened in disbelief. The lieutenant commander knew the stakes. The Pacific Fleet was caught flat-footed, battleships like the West Virginia already ablaze, their magazines threatening to cook off. No, not retreat. Not while his men fought for every inch. Van Valkenburg slammed the radio handset down, his decision crystallizing in the heat of battle. "Ignore that. Keep firing. We're holding this line." Poole hesitated, then nodded, relaying the command. The Arizona's guns thundered in response, tracers arcing upward like fiery veins against the dawn sky. A Kate bomber veered too close, its torpedo released too early, splashing harmlessly into the harbor. Van Valkenburg's burst caught it square, the plane erupting in a fireball that lit the water orange. You can almost feel the deck tilting beneath you, the acrid smoke stinging your eyes as shrapnel whistles past. The captain's choice hangs in the air, heavy as the bombs falling around him. Sailors like Seaman First Class William Andrews, a farm boy from Iowa, clutched his helmet and fired blindly, his hands trembling on the trigger. "They're everywhere, sir!" he yelled, voice cracking over the din. Van Valkenburg clapped a hand on his shoulder, the gesture firm. "Steady, son. We give 'em hell." As the attack intensified, Japanese pilots pressed their advantage. HE-D-3A Vals screaming earthward in steep dives, releasing 550-pound bombs that cratered the earth on Ford Island. The USS Nevada attempted to steam out, her engines churning, but drew fire like a magnet. Van Valkenburg watched her take hits, her forward turret blooming with flame. His own ship rocked from a near miss, the blast wave rattling teeth and loosening rivets. Below decks, damage control parties fought fires with hoses snaking through flooded compartments, the heat baking the air to furnace levels. Intelligence had failed them. Decrypted messages from Tokyo dismissed as bluffs, carriers like the Akagi and Kaga launching their strike from 230 miles out, undetected. Van Valkenburg cursed the oversight, but there was no time for blame. A Zero buzzed the bridge, raking it with 20mm cannon fire. Glass shattered, and Poole slumped, blood blooming on his uniform. "Ensign!" Van Valkenburg dragged him to cover, applying pressure to the wound as medics swarmed. The young man's eyes fluttered. We can't retreat, sir. Not now." The radio squawked again, urgent. "Arizona, confirm retreat order. Do not engage aggressively." Van Valkenburg's jaw set. 10 minutes. That's all he needed. Just 10 more minutes of defiance to buy time for the fighters to scramble from Wheeler Field, for the destroyers to form a screen. He keyed the mic, voice calm, but ironclad. "Negative. We're in the fight." Cutting the line, he turned back to the fray, the horizon now a canvas of smoke and fire. Explosions rippled across the harbor. The USS California settling low in the mud, her crew abandoning ship amid oil-slicked waters. Van Valkenburg's gunners scored hits, a Val disintegrating mid-dive, its pilot parachuting into the inferno below. But the cost mounted. Men vaporized in the blink of an eye, limbs scattered like broken toys. The captain wiped soot from his face, tasting copper on his lips. This wasn't just survival. It was a stand that could shift the tide or doom them all. As the first wave peeled off, spent but victorious, the second bore down, relentless. Van Valkenburg scanned the skies, heart pounding. Retreat be damned. They'd make the enemy pay dearly for every foot of Hawaiian soil. If you're gripped by this moment in history, hit that like button and subscribe for more untold stories from the front lines. The true fury was just beginning, and Van Valkenburg's gamble would echo through the flames yet to come. The second wave sliced through the smoke-choked sky like vultures descending on carrion, their engines a rising drone that drowned out the groans of the dying fleet. Aichi D3A Vals peeled off in formation, sirens wailing as they plunged toward the Arizona, the battleship's deck now a frenzy of sweat-slicked sailors reloading feverishly. Lieutenant Commander Franklin Van Valkenburg braced against the bridge railing, his uniform torn and singed, the salt-streaked wind whipping his face as he scanned the horizon. The harbor was a hellscape. Oil fires licked at the water's surface, turning it into a bubbling black mirror that reflected the chaos above. Explosions from the USS Maryland nearby sent shockwaves rippling across the waves, vibrating through the Arizona's hull like the heartbeat of some wounded giant. "Load high explosive rounds. Target those divers," Van Valkenburg shouted, his voice raw from the acrid bite of cordite. The 5-inch guns swiveled with mechanical precision, their barrels elevating to meet the screaming aircraft. Gunners like Petty Officer Ralph Johnson, a wiry New Yorker with grease-streaked cheeks, cranked the elevation wheels, sweat dripping into his eyes. "Coming in hot, sir! 3 at 12 o'clock!" Johnson yelled, slamming home a shell. The gun roared, the recoil slamming into the mount like a sledgehammer, and a tracer streak lanced upward, clipping the wing of a lead Val. The plane wobbled, smoke trailing from its engine, but pressed on, its bomb bay doors yawning open. You can hear the whistle of that 550-pound bomb cutting the air. Feel the deck buck as it impacts the water just off the starboard bow, the geyser drenching the crew in salt water and debris. Van Valkenburg didn't flinch. He'd seen too many close calls in the Philippines patrols to let fear root him. Instead, he grabbed the speaking tube to the secondary battery. "Fire control! Prioritize the torpedo planes. Don't let them line up. Below, in the armored citadel, fire control parties hunched over plotting tables, their faces illuminated by the glow of analog computers and rudimentary radars, calculating trajectories amid the ship's shuddering. The Japanese pilots were relentless, their Mitsubishi A6M-Zeros providing top cover, darting through bursts of anti-aircraft fire like shadows in a storm. 1-0 banked low over the Arizona, its 7mm machine guns chattering, stitching bullets across the main deck. Seaman William Andrews dove behind a bulkhead, shards of metal pinging off his helmet. "Captain, they're strafing the gun crews!" he called up to the bridge, his voice trembling but resolute. Van Valkenburg nodded grimly, spotting the fighter through the shattered windows. He snatched a pair of 50-caliber machine guns from a fallen gunner, the twin barrels heavy in his grip. Bracing against the console, he squeezed the triggers, the weapons barking in unison, brass flying like golden rain. The Zero veered sharply, trailing smoke, but not before claiming 2 men on the fantail, their cries lost in the cacophony. Radio chatter flooded the bridge, a mix of desperate pleas and fragmented reports. "This is Nevada, taking multiple hits. Can't maneuver." The battleship was aground now, her grey hull scarred and listing, crewmen leaping into the flaming harbour to escape the inferno. Van Valkenburg keyed his own set, ignoring the persistent retreat orders crackling from Pearl's command post. All stations, Arizona holding fire on low threats, focus on bombers, buy time for the P-40s. Name, he knew reinforcements were scrambling from Hickam Field, but the Army Air Force's fighters were grounded, caught with wings folded and pilots at breakfast. It was on the Navy now, these 177 men turning the Arizona into a floating fortress amid the slaughter. A Val broke through, diving at a 60-degree angle, its fixed landing gear giving it the look of a predatory bird. The pilot, Lieutenant Saburo Takahashi from the carrier Soryu, though Van Valkenburg couldn't know his name, released his payload at 1,500 feet. The bomb struck true, piercing the forward deck near the number 1 turret. The explosion was deafening, a thunderclap that hurled men like ragdolls and ignited secondary fires in the handling rooms. Flames whooshed up through hatches, the heat blistering paint and flesh alike. "Damage report!" Van Valkenburg bellowed, coughing through the smoke as he rushed to the ladder, descending to the main deck where medics dragged the wounded clear. Petty Officer Johnson was there, his arm mangled, blood soaking his sleeve, but he waved off help. "Turret 1's out, sir. Magazine's hot. We got a vent or it'll—" His words cut off as another bomb whistled in, this one glancing off the armored belt and detonating in the shallow water, rocking the ship violently. Water flooded the bilges, pumps whining in protest, while above, the Arizona's 1-inch quad mounts pom-pommed away at the retreating Vals, scoring a hit that sent one spiraling into the harbour in a plume of fire and twisted metal. Van Valkenburg moved among his men like a shepherd in the storm, his presence a bulwark against panic. He knelt by Ensign Poole, now stabilized but pale on a stretcher, an IV drip rigged from scavenged medical kits. "Hang in there, Hayden. We're turning this." Poole managed a weak grin. "Aye, sir. No retreating for us." The lieutenant commander clapped his shoulder, then turned to rally the anti-aircraft teams. The air was thick with the stench of burning fuel and ruptured boilers, the deck slippery with oil and blood. Sailors passed ammunition hand to hand, their faces blackened, eyes wild but determined. Farm boys, mechanics, sons of immigrants, all forged in this crucible. From the bridge, through the haze, Van Valkenburg watched the USS Pennsylvania in dry dock take a direct hit, her dry-docked vulnerability turning her into a sitting duck. Japanese Kates skimmed the waves, dropping torpedoes that thudded into the hulls of the USS Utah and Cassin, the destroyer's forward magazine erupting in a chain of blasts that lit the morning like false dawn. The command radio blared again. "Arizona, disengage! Pull back to the inner harbor, that's an order!" Van Valkenburg's fist clenched around the microphone. Disengage. With the second wave breaking apart but not broken, their pilots radioing coordinates back to the task force under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. No. 8 minutes in, and the fleet was bleeding, but the Arizona still floated, her guns speaking defiance. He tossed the handset aside, focusing on the skies clearing momentarily. A handful of PBY Catalinas droned overhead, their crews dropping depth charges in futile anti-submarine runs, ghosts of a defense that never materialized. But in those gaps, Van Valkenburg saw opportunity. Cease fire on stragglers, conserve for the heavies. His call saved rounds, the barrels cooling just enough to avoid meltdown. A Zero, emboldened, looped back for another pass, but Johnson's surviving gun crew nailed it, the fighter crumpling into the water amid cheers that echoed like a brief victory. Yet the cost was mounting, casualties piled in the sick bay, the ship's doctor overwhelmed, morphine running low. Van Valkenburg felt the weight of it all, the decisions etching lines into his face. Intelligence whispers from Washington had hinted at tensions, but no one foresaw this blitz from 6 carriers: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku. 230 aircraft unleashing hell. Below decks, engineers battled flooding, their wrenches slipping on wet steel as bulkheads groaned under pressure. As the second wave fragmented, spent ordnance splashing harmlessly, a final formation of Vals regrouped for one last push. Van Valkenburg's eyes narrowed on the lead plane, its bomb glinting in the sun. 2 minutes left in his self-imposed stand. The air hung heavy with the promise of catastrophe, the Arizona's powder magazines a ticking bomb beneath their feet. Retreat was a whisper now. Drowned by the roar of engines returning for blood, the lead Val hurtled downward, its dive brakes deployed with a mechanical whine that pierced the chaos like a banshee's cry. Lieutenant Commander Franklin Van Valkenburg stood exposed on the Arizona's battered bridge, the wind tearing at his shredded uniform as he tracked the plane through narrowed eyes. The harbor reeked of scorched rubber and evaporating fuel, the water below churning with debris, shattered timbers from the USS Shaw's forward magazine still smoldering after her cataclysmic explosion moments earlier. That blast had lit the sky like a second sun, hurling a 100-foot column of fire and shrapnel that rained down on the fleet, wounding dozens more. Van Valkenburg's crew had flinched but held, their 40mm Bofors guns chattering in defiance, pom-pom shells bursting around the Val like angry hornets. "Steady on target! Bring her down!" Van Valkenburg commanded, his voice cutting through the din as he leaned into the gun director sight, adjusting for the plane's steep trajectory. The Arizona's secondary armament, 8 5-inch 51 caliber guns, thundered in sequence, their muzzles flashing orange against the smoke-hazed dawn. Petty Officer Ralph Johnson, bandaged arm slung across his chest, manned a nearby mount with grim focus, ignoring the blood seeping through the gauze. "Got your range, you bastard," he muttered, cranking the traverse as the shell casings ejected hot and steaming onto the deck. The burst grazed the Val's tail, sending it into a wild spin, but the pilot recovered, jinking left to evade the flak. You feel the ship's pulse quicken, the engines idling below as if the battleship itself senses the endgame. The air vibrates with the staccato of machine guns, bullets zipping past like vengeful wasps, and the distant wail of ambulances on Ford Island, too few to handle the carnage. Van Valkenburg's 10-minute stand was ticking down. The clock in his mind read 8 minutes gone, the retreat orders from Pearl Command, now a fading echo amid the roar. He'd bought time. P-40 Warhawks from Wheeler Field were finally airborne, their radial engines growling as they climbed to intercept stragglers. But at what price? The Arizona listed slightly to port, her bilges sloshing with seawater from near misses, while fires crackled unchecked in the hangar spaces aft. A pair of Nakajima B-5N Kates skimmed in low from the east, their torpedoes slung like deadly pendulums beneath silver fuselages. They targeted the USS West Virginia, already a gutted hulk with her forward section awash in oil and flames, but Van Valkenburg's gunners shifted fire seamlessly. "Torpedo planes, priority!" he barked into the 1MC loudspeaker, the announcement booming through the ship. Seaman William Andrews, his youthful face streaked with grime, hauled a belt of 50 caliber rounds to a depleted mount, his hands raw from the friction. "Loading up." "Sir," he shouted back, feeding the ammo as the gunner squeezed off bursts. One Kate took a direct hit to the cockpit, erupting in a mid-air fireball that cascaded burning fuel across the harbour, igniting patches of floating oil and turning the water into a mosaic of flame. But the Vals pressed on, their formation tightening for the kill. The lead plane, unpiloted by a veteran from the carrier Hiryu, released its 1-760-pound armor-piercing bomb at 100 feet. A converted battleship shell designed to punch through decks and detonate deep. Van Valkenburg saw it detach, a black speck tumbling end over end, the world narrowing to that fatal arc. "Brace, incoming!" he yelled, diving for the armoured conning tower as the deck erupted in a cataclysmic roar. The bomb struck amidships, just forward of the main armoured citadel, penetrating 3 decks before slamming into the black powder magazine below the No. 2 turret. The explosion was apocalyptic, a supernova confined to steel and flesh. A column of fire and debris shot skyward over 500 feet, the shockwave flattening men on the deck and shattering every window within a mile. The Arizona's forward section vaporized in an instant, her hull splitting like overripe fruit, the 14-inch powder bags igniting in a chain reaction that consumed the ship from within. Van Valkenburg was hurled backward, the blast wave slamming him against a bulkhead, his ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out all else. Shrapnel tore through the air, jagged plates of decking, twisted gun barrels, embedding in the bridge structure like deadly confetti. Below, the inferno raged unchecked. The magazines detonated in sequence, secondary blasts rippling through the ship as 100-pound shells cooked off, hurling turret parts hundreds of yards. The forward turrets rocketed upward like missiles, crashing down on the pier and crushing a destroyer tender nearby. Sailors in the handling rooms vanished in puffs of flame, their screams silenced before they could form. Petty Officer Johnson was thrown clear, landing in a heap amid the wreckage, his body broken but alive, miraculously spared by a fallen girder. Seaman Andrews fared worse. Caught mid-reload, he was incinerated, his helmet melting into the deck plating. The harbour transformed in those heartbeats. The USS Tennessee, moored alongside, took the brunt of the flying debris, her deck pocked with craters and crewmen buried under rubble. Oil from ruptured tanks spread like ink, feeding the fires that now linked battleship to battleship in a chain of devastation. From the skies, the remaining Japanese pilots wheeled away, their mission complete, radioing triumph back to Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's task force, lurking 230 miles north. Zeros provided covering fire one last time, strafing survivors in the water, their 20mm cannons chewing through life rafts and rescue lines. Van Valkenburg clawed his way to his feet, vision blurred by blood and smoke, the bridge a twisted skeleton around him. Ensign Hayden Poole lay nearby, his body mangled beyond recognition, a casualty of the blast's fury. "Report! Damage!" the lieutenant commander gasped, coughing black phlegm as he staggered to the edge. The Arizona was done, her bow submerged, stern high and awash, the stars and stripes still fluttering defiantly from the mast amid the flames. Over 100 men gone in that single cataclysm, the worst single loss of the attack. Fires crackled across her length, fed by 16 million gallons of fuel oil now spilling into the bay, threatening to engulf the entire battleship row. Radio static crackled faintly from a surviving set. Arizona, respond. Fleet command, evacuate survivors. But Van Valkenburg ignored it, his 10 minutes up. The battlefield utterly destroyed. P-40s screamed in finally, tangling with the withdrawing Zeros, their 50 caliber guns barking in pursuit. He spotted a handful of his crew swimming clear, medics in whaleboats pulling them from the flaming oil slicks. The cost of defiance etched itself into his soul, the harbor a graveyard of twisted metal and broken dreams, the Pacific Fleet crippled but not broken. Yet as the smoke cleared, revealing the full scope of ruin, 8 battleships damaged or sunk, over 400 dead, Van Valkenburg knew the real battle was just igniting. Japan had struck first, but America's fury would rise from these ashes, and his stand had ensured that some guns had answered back. The waves lapped at the wreckage, carrying whispers of war yet to come. The smoke hung like a funeral shroud over Pearl Harbor, thick and choking, as the echoes of the Arizona's cataclysmic end faded into a mournful silence, broken only by the crackle of dying fires and the distant splashes of debris settling into the oil-slicked water. Lieutenant Commander Franklin Van Valkenburg, thrown clear by the blast's fury, clung to a jagged fragment of the bridge railing that had somehow survived the inferno, his body battered and broken amid the floating wreckage. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead, mixing with the salt water that lapped at his chest. But his eyes, fierce, unyielding, scanned the devastation he'd helped unleash in defiance of orders. The USS Arizona, once a proud Pennsylvania-class battleship with her 8 14-inch guns and armored might, now burned stern up, her forward half a twisted grave for over 1,000 men. The explosion had ripped her apart at 8:06 a.m., precisely 10 minutes after he'd silenced the retreat command, turning Battleship Row into a charnel house of steel and sorrow. You can taste the bitterness on your tongue, the acrid blend of gunpowder residue and spilled bunker fuel, as the harbor's waves gently rock the flotsam. Helmets, life jackets, scraps of khaki uniforms bobbing like ghosts. Van Valkenburg's lungs burned with every ragged breath, shrapnel embedded in his side, sending jolts of fire through his ribs, but he pushed it down, focusing on the survivors clawing their way from the water. Petty Officer Ralph Johnson surfaced nearby, gasping and sputtering, his bandaged arm trailing red ribbons in the sea. "Captain, you made it," Johnson croaked, paddling closer with one good hand, his face a mask of soot and shock. Van Valkenburg nodded weakly, gripping the railing tighter as a whaleboat from the USS Vestal chugged through the haze. Its crew shouting encouragements over the outboard motor's putter. "Over here! We've got wounded!" the coxswain yelled, extending a boat hook that Van Valkenburg latched onto, hauling himself aboard with a grunt of agony. The Vestal, repair ship tied alongside the Arizona, had taken the brunt of the flying debris, her deck littered with turret fragments and unexploded ordnance, but her crew worked with mechanical efficiency, pulling sailors from the drink. Medics in bloodied whites triaged the arrivals, burns, concussions, limbs shattered by the shockwave. Ensign Hayden Poole wasn't among them. Van Valkenburg learned later that the young officer had been vaporized in the bridge, his final words a testament to the stand they'd taken. "Lost too many," Johnson muttered as a corpsman wrapped his wounds, the morphine dulling the edges of pain. Van Valkenburg, propped against a bulkhead, could only stare at the Arizona's hulk, flames still licking her superstructure, the stars and stripes defiantly half-masted on a scorched halyard. His decision, no retreat, hold the line, had cost 177 lives, including his own command, but it had forced the Japanese second wave to pay in blood. At least 9 enemy planes downed by Arizona's guns alone, their pilots' screams silenced in fiery crashes from the Vestal's railing. The full toll unfolded like a nightmare etched in flame and ruin. The USS Oklahoma lay capsized off Ford Island, her hull a grey whale on its side, over 400 trapped inside as rescuers hammered futilely at her hull plates with torches and sledges. The West Virginia smoldered low in the mud, her anti-aircraft batteries silent after expending every round in a blaze of defiance. Destroyers like the Downs and Cassin were gutted skeletons in the dry dock, their magazines cooked off in chain reactions that had shaken the island to its core. Overhead, the last of the Japanese aircraft, straggling Zeros from the carrier Hiryu, wheeled away northward, their red insignias fading into the climbing sun, mission accomplished under Commander Mitsuo Fuchida's triumphant radio call. Tora! 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 Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's task force, 6 carriers strong, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zukaku, lingered 230 miles out, weighing whether to launch a third strike on the fuel depots and airfields. Van Valkenburg's mind raced through the fog of pain, piecing together the intelligence failures that had led here. The magic decrypts from Japanese codes, dismissed as diplomatic noise, radar operators at Opana Point waved off by skeptical superiors, mistaking the inbound raid for scheduled flights. No warning from the carriers Enterprise and Lexington, steaming back from Wake Island, their scout planes too distant to spot the enemy. His own stand had been a spark in the dark, a refusal to yield that inspired pockets of resistance across the fleet. The USS Nevada had steamed out under fire, drawing bombs like a decoy before grounding herself to avoid blocking the channel, her crew cheering as P-40 Warhawks finally tangled with the Zeros, downing several in dogfights that painted the sky with tracer fire and parachutes. A medic pressed a field dressing to Van Valkenburg's wounds, the sting of alcohol sharp against his skin. "You need to rest, sir. Doc says internal bleeding." But rest was a luxury for the living. Van Valkenburg waved him off, staggering to his feet to help with the lines. Sailors from the Arizona, maybe 300 survivors, a fraction of her crew, clambered aboard, their stories tumbling out in gasps. Seaman William Andrews' brother lost in the forward fire room, gun crews who fired until barrels glowed red. "We gave 'em hell, Captain," one whispered, a kid from Texas with burns blistering his hands. Van Valkenburg clasped his shoulder, the weight of command heavier now in defeat. The radio on the Vestal crackled with fragmented updates. "All units, attack concluded. Secure the area. Medical teams to Ford Island." Admiral Husband Kimmel, roused from shore leave, was en route, his face ashen with the realization that the Pacific Fleet's battleship strength, 8 capital ships crippled or sunk, was gutted in under 2 hours. As the whaleboats ferried more wounded to the Naval Hospital on the hill, where nurses like Anne Fox triaged the influx amid screams and the stench of gangrene setting in, Van Valkenburg felt the shift in the air. The Japanese had struck a blow to awaken a sleeping giant, but his 10 minutes of defiance had ensured the fleet's remnants, carriers untouched, submarines slipping out to sea, could regroup. From the Vestal's deck, he watched firefighters from the USS Curtis battle the blazes, their hoses snaking across the water, while divers prepared to search the Arizona's hull for trapped men, the taps of Morse code from inside already faint and fading. The harbor, once a bastion of American power, now echoed with the human cost. 2, 403 dead, 178 wounded, civilian casualties mounting from stray bombs on Hickam Field. Nagumo's carriers turned east by mid-morning, evading patrols, but leaving behind a trail of victory that would prove Pyrrhic. In Washington, President Roosevelt drafted his address, the date which will live in infamy, galvanizing a nation from isolation to total war. Van Valkenburg, carried to the sickbay on a stretcher, his vision blurring from blood loss, whispered to Johnson, "We didn't retreat. That's something." The petty officer nodded, eyes on the horizon where smoke still rose like a warning. But as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the wreckage, whispers of retaliation stirred. Task Force 16, forming under Admiral William Halsey, the Doolittle raid months away, island-hopping campaigns to come. The battlefield was destroyed, yes, but from its ashes, Vengeance brewed, a fire that would consume the Pacific. The days blurred into a haze of antiseptic sting and muffled voices for Lieutenant Commander Franklin van Valkenburg, his world reduced to the white walls of the Naval Hospital on Pearl Harbor's outskirts. The explosion's fury had claimed more than the Arizona. It had torn through his body, embedding shrapnel in his lung and fracturing ribs that ground like gravel with every breath. Morphine dripped steadily from an IV stand, dulling the edges of pain but sharpening the memories. The whistle of that final Val's bomb, the deck buckling beneath him, the roar that swallowed screams and steel alike. Outside the window, palm fronds swayed in the trade winds, mocking the calm that had shattered on December 7th. You can almost hear the creak of the hospital ship Solace's gangway as orderlies wheel you through corridors alive with the groans of the wounded, the sharp tang of iodine cutting the air. Van Valkenburg's eyes, bandaged loosely against infection, fluttered open to the dim glow of a bedside lamp. Petty Officer Ralph Johnson sat vigil in a rickety chair, his own arm in a sling, face gaunt under the fluorescent hum. "Captain, they pulled you out just in time," Johnson said, voice thick with exhaustion. He'd swum through the flaming oil slicks himself, dodging debris from the Arizona's upended turrets, massive 14-inch behemoths that had crashed onto the Vestal like fallen gods. Van Valkenburg managed a rasp, throat raw from smoke inhalation. "The ship? Gone, sir. But we got some payback. Those P-40s from the 48th Pursuit Squadron downed 4 Zeros before they bugged out." Johnson's words carried the weight of survival, a threadbare comfort amid the 403 souls lost across the harbor. Nurses bustled past, their starched uniforms whispering, tending to men from the USS California, her crew trapped below decks until divers cut them free days later. Van Valkenburg's mind wandered to the intelligence black hole that had allowed Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and their sisters, to slip in undetected, launching 353 aircraft in waves that crippled 8 battleships and sank the Arizona outright. By December 8th, as President Franklin D. Roosevelt's voice crackled over radios nationwide, a date which will live in infamy, Van Valkenburg was lucid enough for visitors. Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, his uniform rumpled from sleepless nights, entered the ward flanked by intelligence officers from Station Hypo, the codebreakers who'd partially unraveled Japan's JN-25 naval cipher but failed to connect the dots. Kimmel's face was etched with defeat, the blame already shifting like sand in a storm. "Your stand on the Arizona. It bought us time, Commander. Those guns of yours forced the second wave to scatter." Fuchida himself noted the unexpected fire in his after-action report, captured later. But the Admiral's eyes held accusation too. The retreat order, ignored, had escalated the toll. Van Valkenburg met his gaze steadily, the morphine haze no match for duty's clarity. "We couldn't run, sir, not with the fleet exposed. If we'd pulled back, the carriers might have pressed for the oil tanks." Kimmel nodded curtly, the room heavy with unspoken inquiries. The Roberts Commission would probe the failures soon, dismissed radar warnings from Opana Point, where Privates George Elliott and Joseph Lockhart had tracked the inbound raid at 7:02 a.m., only to be waved off. The bomb plot messages from Tokyo, decrypted but buried in bureaucracy. Van Valkenburg's defiance emerged as a footnote in the chaos, praised in whispers by survivors, but scrutinized for its cost. Johnson leaned in later, after the brass left. "They say Nagumo chickened out on the third strike. Our subs shadowing his force spooked him. Your 10 minutes might have tipped that scale." Recovery stretched into weeks, the hospital a microcosm of the war's awakening. Van Valkenburg hobbled on crutches to the ward's porch, overlooking the harbor, where salvage crews swarmed the wreckage. The Arizona's stern protruded like a skeletal finger from the shallow mud, her hull entombed in 40 feet of water, bodies still unrecovered, 177 entombed as she became an eternal tomb. Divers from the USS Pigeon, their aqualungs bubbling, welded patches on the USS Nevada, refloated and defiant, her engines churning again by December 10th. From afar, the West Virginia's anti-aircraft gunners, who'd fired blindly into the smoke until barrels melted, shared stories of the Arizona's thunderous response, crediting Van Valkenburg's command for inspiring their own holdout. News from the mainland filtered in via shortwave, Congress declaring war on Japan with one dissenting vote, isolation shattered. Envoys from Germany and Italy followed, dragging America into the European theater too. Van Valkenburg, cleared for light duty by January 1942, reported to the submarine base at Pearl, his limp a badge of the inferno. There, he briefed captains like William Bull Halsey on the attack's lessons, anti-aircraft drills intensified, radar networks overhauled, the fleet dispersing to avoid another sitting duck scenario. Halsey clapped his shoulder, eyes like flint. "You didn't retreat, Commander. That's the spirit we'll need for Midway, for Guadalcanal." Yet doubts gnawed in quiet moments. Letters from home, his wife in Virginia, sons too young for the draft, spoke of rationing and bond drives, the nation's grief channeled into resolve. Johnson, reassigned to the destroyer USS Shore, visited before shipping out, his grin fierce. "Heard they're raising the Oklahoma next month, gonna fight back with her too." Van Valkenburg watched him go, the harbor's waters now patrolled by PBY Catalinas on anti-submarine sweeps, their depth charges ready for revenge. By spring, as the Doolittle Raid's B-25 Mitchells launched from the USS Hornet, payback for Pearl, Van Valkenburg took command of a shore battery at Fort Kamehameha, his guns overlooking the very waves that had birthed the storm. The Arizona's oil still seeped from her grave, black tears staining the sea, a reminder of sacrifice. He'd defied retreat, and 10 minutes later the battlefield lay in ruins. But from those ruins, the U.S. Pacific Fleet rebuilt, carriers like Enterprise and Yorktown steaming west, their Wildcat fighters itching for the skies over the Coral Sea. Whispers of a larger reckoning grew, battles on the horizon where one man's stand echoed in the roar of engines yet to come. Months turned into a relentless grind for Lieutenant Commander Franklin Van Valkenburg, his days now measured in the salt spray of drills and the hum of reconnaissance flights over Oahu's scarred shores. By mid-1942, the limp from his shattered ribs had eased into a mere hitch, but the ghosts of Pearl Harbor clung tighter, the acrid tang of oil fires that invaded his dreams, the phantom roar of the Arizona's magazines detonating like Judgment Day. Assigned to the staff of Admiral Chester Nimitz at Pacific Fleet Headquarters, he pored over maps in dimly lit war rooms, the air thick with cigarette smoke and the clack of teletype machines spitting dispatches from the front. Nimitz, a steady hand with a sailor's squint, valued Van Valkenburg's first-hand account, folding it into strategies that transformed the Pacific from a graveyard to a gauntlet. You can feel the tension coil in the humid air of the briefing room, charts pinned with red and blue flags marking Japanese advances. Wake fallen, Philippines crumbling under General Douglas MacArthur's retreat to Corregidor. Van Valkenburg's voice, gravelly from healed lungs, cut through the murmurs as he described the Arizona's final stand. "We fired until the barrels glowed, sir. Ignored retreat to force their hand. Bought those extra minutes for the fighters to scramble." Nimitz nodded, his pipe clenched between teeth, eyes on the model of Nagumo's carriers lurking in the vast blue. "That fire you laid down saved more than you know, Commander. It's the spine we'll need at Midway." The Battle of Midway in June 1942 became Van Valkenburg's vindication from afar, a chess match of codebreakers and carriers that echoed his defiance. Station hypos cryptanalysts, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, cracked the remnants of Japan's JN-25 code, luring Nagumo's fleet, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, into a trap. From the radio room in Pearl, Van Valkenburg listened to the crackle of reports. Dauntless dive bombers from USS Enterprise and Yorktown screaming down on the Japanese decks at 10:22 a.m., their 1,000-pound bombs turning the carriers into infernos. Akagi's flight deck erupted first, fueled planes igniting in chain reactions that mirrored the Arizona's doom. 4 carriers sunk in minutes, the tide turning on the very tactics that had gutted Battleship Row. Petty Officer Ralph Johnson, wired from the USS Shore, refloated and refitted with new 5-inch 38 guns. "Heard the news, Captain. Payback's sweet. We got 'em good." Van Valkenburg smiled faintly in the ops center, the victory a balm on old wounds. But glory was fleeting. Guadalcanal followed in August, a meat grinder of jungle rot and naval clashes, where destroyers like the USS Barton exploded under Japanese long-lance torpedoes, their long lances outranging American Mark 15s. Van Valkenburg contributed to torpedo upgrades, his testimony on Pearl's chaos informing designs for the Mark 18 electric fish, silent hunters that would stalk I-boats and IJN subs alike. By 1943, promoted to commander for conspicuous gallantry, Van Valkenburg took sea duty aboard the light cruiser USS Montpellier, part of Task Force 38 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher. The Solomons campaign tested him anew. The night actions off Vela La Vela, a symphony of radar pips and gun flashes in the dark. "Surface contacts bearing 270, the CIC officer barked, and Van Valkenburg gripped the radar repeater, heart pounding as 6-inch salvos lit the sea. They sank a Japanese destroyer flotilla. The enemy's screams lost in the waves, but lost the USS Helena in a later brawl. 1. Rear 0 sailors to the deep, a reminder that war devoured the defiant as readily as the cautious. Letters from home sustained him, his wife describing victory gardens in Virginia, sons enlisting in the Navy, inspired by clippings of Pearl survivors. "Your stand made the papers here. The captain who wouldn't retreat," she wrote, enclosing a faded photo of the Arizona's memorial plaque, under construction to honor the entombed. Van Valkenburg traced the names, Poole, Andrews, 1,000 others, his finger lingering on his own survival as fluke. Johnson rose to Chief Petty Officer on the shore, surviving kamikaze strikes at Leyte Gulf, where Van Valkenburg's Montpellier screened carriers against 4-0 Japanese sorties. The battle's fury peaked on October 25, 1944, as Taffy 3's destroyers, Johnston, Hole, Samuel B. Roberts, charged battleships like the Yamato in a suicidal stand, their 5-inch guns blazing until hulls split. Van Valkenburg watched from afar, the reports evoking his own 10 minutes. "They're going in, sir. No retreat," a junior officer whispered over the TBS radio. The battle off Samar turned the tide, MacArthur's landing secured, but at a cost that scarred the soul. Halsey's carriers baited north, leaving the transports exposed. Iwo Jima and Okinawa followed. Hellscapes of flamethrowers and B-29 superfortress raids that leveled Tokyo, avenging Pearl's sneak attack. Van Valkenburg's cruiser dodged kamikazes, their zero-laden vals plunging with 550-kilo warheads. The sky, a deadly ballet of Wildcats and Hellcats from the Essex-class carriers. VJ Day dawned on September 2, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, where Van Valkenburg stood among the Allied officers as Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu signed the surrender. The harbor's calm mocked Pearl's chaos, the Missouri's 16-inch guns silent sentinels. Nimitz accepted on behalf of the U.S. His words measured, "We have paid dearly." Van Valkenburg, silver threading his hair, felt the weight lift slightly. The Pacific reclaimed. Japan's empire shattered from the Marianas to the home islands. Johnson attended too on the shore, their reunion a quiet clasp amid the cheers. Stories of lost comrades exchanged like sacred relics. Retiring in 1947 as captain, Van Valkenburg returned to Virginia, teaching naval history at Annapolis Adjunct. his lectures vivid with the harbor's smoke and the defiance that defined him. The Arizona Memorial opened in 1962, a white bridge over the sunken ship, oil still bubbling from her hull like tears for the 177. He visited once, crutches traded for a cane, laying a wreath as taps echoed over the water. 10 minutes, he murmured to the waves, and the world changed. His death in 1970 came quietly, heart giving out mid-story to grandchildren. But his legacy endured. In Midway's pivot, Guadalcanal's grit, the firebombings that forced surrender. The battlefield destroyed at Pearl birthed an unbreakable resolve, one man's stand rippling through the war's end, ensuring the sun would never rise again on such surprise. The Pacific, once aflame, now whispered peace, but the echoes of those guns thundered on in history's unyielding march.